This video is sponsored by Squarespace. When you think of mirrorless cameras these days, you probably immediately think of brands like Sony, Canon, Nikon, Panasonic, and Fujifilm, all of whom are very much leading the charge. Well, that wasn't always the case. In fact, back in 2010, right at the dawn of the mirrorless camera age, there were only 4 companies making mirrorless cameras: Panasonic, Olympus, Sony, and Samsung. Yeah, that's right, that Samsung. A few years later, Canon, Nikon, Pentax, and Fujifilm all eventually threw their hats into the ring too, but all of them had serious teething problems. I mean, except for Fujifilm, which has pretty much remained constant throughout. Samsung, on the other hand, seemed to hit the ground running and quickly became one of the front runners in this market. The cameras were generally well received, and some of them even offered pretty pioneering features that really helped to shape mirrorless cameras into what they are today. Unfortunately though, all of that changed pretty abruptly when Samsung ceased production of its entire digital camera division, leaving many people scratching their heads. So why were these cameras so popular? Why did Samsung stop producing them, and are they still worth buying today? Well, I recently managed to get my hands on this, which is the Samsung NX3000. It was one of the last cameras that the company ever produced. Just like most other camera brands these days, Samsung's lineup of cameras was a tiered hierarchy. You had your single and double-digit DSLR-styled high-end cameras at the very top, and beneath that were the mid-range triple and quadruple-digit cameras, which adopted a smaller rangefinder-style design. Samsung also released some experimental cameras during its reign, including the NX Mini, which is one of, if not the smallest mirrorless camera ever made, and this is a camera I've also looked at previously on this channel. And then there was the Galaxy NX, which was arguably the most out there camera of the lot, and I've actually recently bought one of them, so expect to see a separate video on this bad boy in the near future. Anyway, one of the things that drew light onto Samsung's NX range in particular was that they were some of the first mirrorless cameras to include APS-C size sensors. Full-frame mirrorless cameras wouldn't become a thing until the release of the original Sony A7 a few years later in 2013. So for a while at least, these were some of the only cameras that offered a larger sensor that was comparable to the much more popular choice at the time, the DSLR. But unlike the big bulky DSLRs, the advantage of owning a mirrorless camera like this was that it could be produced much smaller whilst maintaining the same level of image quality. Now this model in particular was very reasonably priced too, and at launch you could pick one of these up for around $400 brand new, but body only, or around $530 with the 16 to 50mm kit lens. Now these days of course you can find these on auction sites like eBay for even cheaper than that. I bought this one body only on eBay for just under £120, which is around $155. Stylistically, I mean, it certainly looks the part, and I even like the modern take on the whole classic leather and metal two-tone finish. However, when you do look a little bit closer, you do start to see why this thing was just so cheap. And that's because whilst this may look like leather, it's actually just plastic. In fact, most of the camera has been made from plastic, with the lens mount and the tripod thread being the only two things that I can obviously tell are made from metal. But that's not to say that this feels poor quality. In fact, it feels absolutely solid as a rock in the hand, and everything appears to be finished to a very high standard. Plus, the plastic build certainly gives it an advantage in terms of weight, because body only, this weighs just 266 grams, or around 9.4 ounces. And although it probably won't fit in your jeans, it'll certainly sit comfortably in your jacket pocket, especially if you pair it with one of the smaller prime lenses on offer, like this 30mm f2 that I bought, though a little bit more on this a little bit later on. But before we take a look at how this thing handles, I first need to mention today's sponsor, and that's Squarespace. Now, whether you're a total beginner or a seasoned veteran, every photographer needs a high quality website to showcase their work, and I've personally been using Squarespace to build and host a number of websites over the years. That's largely because I have basically zero experience building websites, but with a huge range of templates to choose from and its simple drag and drop interface, it honestly has never been easier to create a professional looking website in just a matter of minutes. So if you want to get started, simply head over to squarespace.com/Tom Calton and save 10% off your first purchase of either a website or a domain using the code Tom Calton. And thank you once again to Squarespace for sponsoring this episode and supporting the channel. Now, although this is an entry-level model, it still includes many of the pro features you'd expect to see on larger cameras, such as a range of manual and semi-manual shooting modes, raw image capture, and a respectable 20.3 megapixel APS-C size sensor. On the back, there's a large 3-inch display which is able to pull up and over to aid with shooting at lower angles and for taking selfies. And if you enable the so-called wink mode, you can even take them hands-free. Though surprisingly, the screen isn't actually touch sensitive, which is a little bit odd for a Samsung camera considering the advancements the company made in touchscreen technology at the time, but I can only assume that this was done as a cost-cutting measure. It's almost certainly the same reason why this doesn't include a built-in EVF as well. But anyway, next to the screen is the main D-pad, which also doubles as a command dial with all of the shortcuts to the options you would expect to find. The function button here grants you quick access to a more detailed list of options, and they did even manage to cram in a custom button right at the bottom here should you actually need it. Although there's no built-in flash, it does have a full-sized hot shoe, which is somewhat of a rarity for cameras of this price point, and this is predominantly used for mounting the detachable flash unit that comes included in the box. Now, one thing Samsung did have a really good grasp on was the importance of connectivity, which is somewhat to be expected given that they were and still are giants within the smartphone world. As a result, most Samsung cameras offered ways in which to quickly and seamlessly transfer your images from your camera to your smartphone so that you could share them on social media platforms. This NX3000 is absolutely no exception to that, and you can find a dedicated mobile button on the top plate for connecting to smart devices, and there's even a Wi-Fi option on the Modile itself and NFC connectivity. I mean, so far, all pretty normal, right? Well, that is until you look at the bottom here.
Look at my fanny, look at my fanny, look at my fanny.
Because in my opinion, the only slightly weird design choices made to this camera can be found in this compartment on the bottom. That's right, this credit card looking thing is actually the battery, which I can only assume is something that has been repurposed from another Samsung smart device. To be fair though, other than looking a little bit out of place, there's nothing wrong with the battery per se, and the battery life is actually pretty good, even by today's standards. The only problem it causes is that its elongated shape means that the battery hatch has also had to be made quite long, and that means that it's very easily blocked as soon as this thing is mounted to a tripod, which is really annoying. To make things slightly worse, it's also where the memory card is located, and unfortunately Samsung opted to use a micro SD card instead of a full-sized one, which obviously will have an impact on the write speeds of this camera, as we'll see a little bit later on. Now, although this NX3000 does have a dedicated video capture mode, this is fairly limited, with recording options capped at 1080 HD with a choice of either 25 or 30 frames per second. That's it. There's no headphone or mic ports either, though Samsung did sell a separate external mic accessory that you could connect to the hot shoe for better audio quality. But anyway, before buying any camera that uses interchangeable lenses, it always pays to not only consider the camera specs, but also put some time into researching what lens mount it uses and the lens options available to you. And I make a point of mentioning that because one of the slight downsides to using this now defunct NX range is that Samsung didn't really get much of a chance to develop an extensive set of lenses for it. This camera, just like all of the other NX cameras, with the exception of the NX Mini, utilized Samsung's homegrown NX mount, and in total there were just 15 own brand lenses released for it. That said, some third-party manufacturers, most notably Samyang, not Samsung, also made some of its earlier lenses available for the NX mount. So you can often find some of these kicking around on eBay for pretty cheap, though they are all manual focus only. Now, rather than going for the kit lens, I decided to buy a 30mm f2 pancake lens, which gives a full frame equivalent field of view of roughly 45mm. Hilariously though, this lens actually ended up costing me more than the camera itself. So for me, I felt that this was well worth the investment for two main reasons. Firstly, its incredibly small form factor helps to keep this combo lightweight and able to fit into my jacket pocket. And secondly, I personally just really enjoy shooting with a focal length between 35 and 50mm in full frame turns at least, and this certainly ticks all of those boxes. So what is this camera actually like to shoot with? Well, overall, I was pleasantly surprised with it. Starting with the positives, it's super lightweight, as I've already mentioned, and that means that it's an absolute joy to carry around with you for a full day of shooting. I'm also a big fan of the flip-up screen, not only because this gives you something extra to hold on to, which is only a good thing because the front grip is fairly shallow and a little bit slippery, but for candid styles of photography, it also comes in really handy as it allows you to shoot from the hip, meaning you don't draw nearly as much attention to yourself. And finally, not only does this have a proper mechanical shutter, but it's also surprisingly quiet, making it way more discreet. In terms of negatives, the only real one is that it is fairly slow. I mean, it's absolutely not the slowest camera I've ever shot with. I'm looking at you, Leica M8.
Could you be any slower?
But there is a noticeable delay after taking each shot as the raw files write to the card. And although this can shoot in continuous burst mode up to 5 frames per second, after 3 or 4 shots, everything grinds to a halt, and you'll be locked out for a few seconds as the shots write to the card. Personally, I like to shoot slow anyway, so it really didn't take away from any of the enjoyment I had while while shooting with this camera, but it certainly isn't going to be the best choice for fast-paced shooting. But if you can muster the patience with it, the image quality produced by this combo is absolutely brilliant. The images display lovely colors straight out of the camera, and it provides perfectly usable shots up to ISO 6400, meaning that this is absolutely a camera that can deliver professional quality photos. Anyway, as I mentioned a bit earlier on, this was one of the last releases from Samsung, and although it did see a successor, the NX3300, it was essentially just a rebadged version of this camera, albeit for a slight firmware update. So it was pretty clear to most that Samsung had all but given up the fight by this point. And not long after that, in 2016, Samsung would completely cease production of its camera line. So why did Samsung decide to pull the plug? Well, although there has never been an official statement on the matter, Samsung representatives did confirm that the NX1, which was their flagship model, that was discontinued in the UK and Germany due to a decline in demand for digital cameras. Samsung then continued to pull its camera business from all major markets, and its engineering resources that were previously dedicated to the NX line were later transferred over to the company's mobile division. Now, reading between the lines here, I think it's probably safe to assume that Samsung's range of smartphones were just selling way better than their cameras were, so it did what any smart business would do, and it consolidated all of its knowledge and resources into what it considered to be the safer bet. But as they say, one man's trash is another man's treasure, so considering that these cameras are now selling for so cheap online, do I actually think that this is a camera system that's worth buying into today? Well, maybe. I mean, obviously, as time goes on, these cameras will become increasingly outdated and will likely decline in price even further. So if you're in this for the long haul, then it's probably better to buy into a camera system with a more stable future ahead of it. But that said, if you're just looking for a cheap but very capable camera for casual photography, or maybe even to get you started out on your photography journey in the first place, then getting a camera like this NX3000 could potentially be a smart way to capture high quality images without breaking the bank.